Hi, I'm Dan Toomey, a Senior Integration Specialist at Mexia Consulting, and also the leader of the Brisbane BizTalk User Group. In this webcast, I'm going to show you how to use Enterprise Single Sign-On to securely host your application configuration in a distributed BizTalk Server environment. Anyone who installs or configures BizTalk Server is already familiar with Enterprise Single Sign-On, or SSO, because it's a mandatory part of the BizTalk platform. You'd probably be aware that it is primarily a credential management database designed to securely store a range of authentication details that might be required by BizTalk when integrating with a number of different systems. Some would also know that BizTalk uses SSO to store the potentially restricted properties associated with its port and adapter configurations. For example, the proxy username and password in the HTTP adapter. This is partly the reason why it's a required component for the platform. But relatively few people realize that SSO is equally adept at storing custom application configuration details, regardless of whether these items are specifically relevant to credential management. It's already designed to work in a distributed environment, which describes most BizTalk deployments, and it's particularly good at storing these details securely, providing out-of-the-box application-level control over who has access to these details. After all, security is what SSO is all about. Just ask any IT administrator who has suffered the unhappy experience of losing the master secret server. The way this works is by the concept of affiliate applications. An SSO application is a container for either a set of credentials or a set of configuration items. In either case, each container comes with its own access and control, including separate assignable groups for regular users and for administrators. To understand the benefits that SSO has to offer in the way of application configuration, let's do a quick review of the typical config options that are available to us in BizTalk. Probably the most familiar mechanism for application configuration, particularly to .NET developers, is the good old application config file. This would be a webconfig file to web developers or an AppConfig file to desktop or Windows Service applications. Developers are well acquainted with the app settings element and its nested collection of key value pairs. If you're new to BizTalk, it may not be obvious that this option exists, but since BizTalk essentially runs as a Windows service, there is indeed an associated AppConfig file. In fact, there are two of them, one each for the 32-bit and the 64-bit hosts. Inserting an app settings element into one or both of these files makes the embedded keys available to all host instances running in that mode. The plus side of this approach is that it's easy and familiar and enables a developer to quickly escape the very naughty temptation to hard-code config values into a map or an orchestration. But there's always a cost for the easy way out. The downside of this approach is that it offers no security unless you want to implement a custom encryption routine. It's also not distributed, as you would need to duplicate these settings not only in both the 32-bit and 64-bit XML files, but also on each distinct BizTalk server in the group. At the same time, since there is only one XML file for all host instances running in that mode, there is no straightforward ability to isolate the config to specific applications, and more importantly, control access to the configuration based on the relevant application. A better option might be to store configuration in a custom database, and indeed this is also a very typical approach. Most .NET programmers are familiar with data access routines offered by ADO.NET or the Entity Framework model. BizTalk also provides adapters for database access, including the WCF SQL adapter, which has replaced the clumsy old SQL adapter. Because the database is a central repository, it is indeed a viable solution for a distributed environment, and a DBA could implement the required security access. The downside is that it is obviously not as quick and easy to implement as the XML file configuration, since you would not only have to design and implement the database itself, but also potentially the code to access that data. Also, implementing granular security would be a shared task for the developer and the DBA, and would need to be factored into the design. Another option that isn't often considered by BizTalk developers is the built-in business rules engine. Already an underutilized resource, most novice BizTalk developers, and even a few veteran ones at that, probably don't realize that the BRE is an excellent vehicle for holding configuration as well as conditional business logic. All that's required is a simple condition that always evaluates to true, for instance 1 equals 1, and the associated action can return a bit of XML containing all the relevant key value pairs. Even better, the condition might contain the name of an application or other container which would govern which set of key value pairs to return. Amongst the numerous advantages to the BRE are the fact that it not only supports versioning but actually enforces it, that a .NET API opens up access beyond orchestrations, and that it is the only option presented here that does not require any host restarts to pick up the changes. The only real downside is that it requires its own unique development platform, one typically unfamiliar to developers and business analysts alike. Finally, we come to the subject of this presentation, which is SSO as a configuration option. Although not the easiest of the options to implement, it is certainly not the most difficult. Managing the configuration items also requires one or two additional free tools, but the best features of SSO are all offered straight out of the box and require no custom programming effort, namely distributed environment support, excellent security, and granular access control by self-defined applications. The .NET API is available via examples in the SDK. We'll have a look at that in a bit. This isn't by any means an exhaustive list of configuration options, but I believe we've covered the four most common approaches. As you can see in this table, the only competitor to SSO in terms of green ticks is the BRE, which is a very valid approach if security is not your primary concern. Perhaps I'll cover config using the BRE in a later webcast. The question marks reflect evaluations that are either somewhat subjective or features that are not offered out of the box but could be achieved with some custom effort. At the end of the day, you need to choose the option that is best for your particular circumstances and requirements. The purpose of this webcast is not to sell you on any exclusive choice, but to simply educate you to ensure that SSO is considered where it's appropriate. So, what configuration tools do we get out of the box when we install SSO? Well, there's an SSO command line utility that gives us most of the required control, including the ability to create, list, and delete applications. The create option requires an XML file parameter that details the structure of our application container. We'll take a look at a sample on the next slide. There's also a separate command line utility that allows us to put values against the configuration items we create. Note that this is a two-step process. Creating the application using SSO Manage doesn't assign any values to the keys, it only defines the keys themselves. Within the SDK bundled into developer install files, we'll find this executable, but it needs to be compiled first via the included setup batch file before you can use it. When you use the SSO Manage utility to create an application, you need to pass it the path to an XML file that defines the application structure. Here's a sample file. Let's go through and take notice of some of the attributes. First, we have some obvious attributes and elements that describe the application, including the name. Then we have a contact detail, which should be in the form of an email address. The intention, I suppose, is to give users some idea of who's responsible for supporting this application. The field isn't mandatory, and the SSO system itself will never use this email. In fact, the default address for all configuration that BizTalk uses SSO for is literally someone@microsoft.com. However, I highly recommend you provide this field and pay careful attention to the organization token. We'll talk about why this is important later. Then you have two accounts to be specified: the authorized user, who has access to this information, and the authorized administrator, who can make changes. These items are mandatory and will be validated by the system, so they must resolve to existing domain or local accounts or groups. I recommend using groups as it's much easier to manage, and these two groups that are already defined when you configure BizTalk is probably as good a choice as any for most situations. If you want to control access to each application independently, then you would obviously create a specific group for each application. Next, you have a collection of fields which define the properties unique to this group. Because this is a configuration store, denoted by this flag attribute here, then these properties define the keys in your key value pairs. There's a few things to note here. Each ordinal number must be unique, and preferably in sequence. The first key, ordinal number 0, is not visible, but it must be present. Consider this a dummy value. If you forget to put this in, you'll find that your first configuration item doesn't show up when expected. The masked attribute presumably controls whether the value appears masked in a user interface text field. However, I've found this makes little difference in any of the UI tools that I've used so far. Note that we do not attach values to these keys in this XML, but only define the keys as empty elements. You can try embedding values in these elements, but you'll find that they won't be stored when the application is created. You'll need to assign these values using the separate command line utility we mentioned earlier. Remember, it's a two-step process. Lastly, we have a few flags that must be set, including the one that defines this as a configuration store app as opposed to a credential store, and whether or not it's enabled. The allow local account setting should only be set to yes in a single user environment. If you don't like using command line tools, and let's face it, most people don't unless you're looking for scripted deployments, there is an MMC snap-in available that allows you to do all this in a GUI console. It's a free download from Microsoft, and it even comes with its own MS build task. I'll demonstrate the installation of this utility in a moment because there's an important screen to be aware of when you need to manage SSO data that you've created through some other means other than this snap-in. Now that we have our config store, we move on to the problem of how to read from it. If you download the sample application from MSDN, there's a link in the resources slide at the end of this presentation, you'll find a Visual Studio solution with an SSO config helper class defined. This class contains methods for both reading and programmatically writing configuration from and to SSO. There's even a unit test in the solution to demonstrate its use, although you'll find it needs a little tweaking to get it to run properly. We'll have a look at this in the demo. In this demo, I'm going to cover using the command line tools to create and populate an SSO config store, installing the SSO application config MMC snap-in, using it to modify and create config data, and using the .NET API to query data. So here we are in our familiar Visual Studio environment, and I have here the sample solution that I downloaded from MSDN, which teaches us how to interact with SSO. It contains the SSO config helper class that we mentioned earlier. And as you can see, that class contains a configuration property bag definition, which is our interface to working with the SSO properties, and the SSO config helper class, which contains two static methods for reading and writing to SSO. Now, this code is exactly as is from Microsoft. I haven't changed anything about it. The only thing I have done in this solution is add a console app to interact with it. It's a little bit nicer than the unit tests that are provided. So my console app just gives you the opportunity to enter an application and enter keys to search for within that application where it displays the values to the console. I've also created an XML file which we can use to create the application that we're going to work with. So you can see that I've given it a very original name. I've got a generic email address here. Notice that the organization name is my company. That'll be important later. And I've created, remembering that the first key is a dummy one, I've created two keys that we're actually going to use in this application, a username and a password. So with this XML file, I can create this app using the command line utility. So here's a command prompt that I've launched in admin mode. First thing we have to do is navigate to the directory where the Enterprise Single Sign-On utility lives. And from there we can call up SSO Manage. So the first thing we'll do is display the help. So you can see all the commands that you have to work with there. You can pretty much do everything you need to do from the command line. So we're going to create this application, but first I'll just attempt to display the app to show you that it doesn't exist. Now we'll go to create it using the create apps flag. All you do is you pass it the path to the XML file that we created. And you can see that it gives you back confirmation that the application was created and also spits out a few of the properties. There's our generic email address, the name of the application, and here's the keys that I created and whether or not they're masked. Now that we've actually created the application, we need to add some values to it. Remember, this only creates the keys, not the values. So to do that, we have to use another utility. And this utility is actually bundled in the developer install of BizTalk. So here's the installation files that we downloaded when I installed the developer edition of BizTalk. And if we go down to BT Server, down to MSI, down to program files, SDK, scenarios, and common, and we eventually get to SSO application config. Now when you first look at it, it won't have all of these files. It will have the uncompiled source there. So the first thing you have to do is run this setup bat, and that will build the project, and then in the bin directory you'll actually have your utility, which is really just a command line utility. So remembering where that is, we can now use that path to call up that utility. So with this, I can now create configuration items using this interface. So the first configuration I want to set the value for is my username, and we'll just give that the default username. Okay, and while we're here, we'll also set the password. And for all you hackers out there, this is not my real password. Now, if I were to run the display app command again, it would not show anything different than it did before, because the display app doesn't actually display the values of the keys. It just displays the keys that are actually stored. But if we go back to our .NET client and run that, I should now be able to query these values. So I enter the application name and then the key that I want to look up. And there it is. So this console is simply calling that .NET class that was downloaded in the sample. And even though I marked the password to be a masked value, you can see that it just comes straight out in clear text. So using the command line is great when you want to actually script your deployments. For example, you could create a script to create your SSO applications and the configuration items in it, and then bundle it in a pre-processing or post-processing script with your BizTalk MSI. But if you're going to work with it on a daily basis, you probably don't want to use the command line. So Microsoft has provided an MMC snap-in that you can use to work with this in a little bit more friendlier interface. So I've downloaded it here, and we're going to install it right now. And the reason I'm taking you through the installer is because there's a pretty critical screen here, and it's this one. You're required to enter a company name, and you need to pay attention to what that is. I'm just going to enter my own company name right now, and then wait while that installs. I have to admit, this isn't the sexiest interface to use with for using SSO. There's a couple of other third-party utilities you can download that are much better. Richard Sirota has a very good one. But for the purposes of this demo, this will work just fine. Now that that's installed, we'll just call it up. And I know I'm going to have to call this a couple of times, so I'm just going to pin it to my start menu. You'll see that it launches in admin mode. And you'll notice the company name that I entered appears here as part of the name in the tree. Now, we know that I created my application called My Application, so we expect to see it here in the console when we look for it. But as you can tell, it's not listing. There's the ability to add a new application, but the one that I created through the command line is not there. Why is that? Well, if we go to SQL and look in the SSO database, there's a table in there called application info, and this is where all the applications are stored. So we'll just open that up in edit mode. Now, all of these applications that have GUID names here are the ones that BizTalk creates as part of its normal processing of all your port send and receive ports, because remember, it uses those containers to store credentials for you. But if we scroll to the bottom, we'll see my custom application is listed here. And you remember that we had this very generic email address. Well, the way this snap-in has been written, it does a string compare on that email address when it's actually retrieving the applications to display. So if your company name doesn't match the company name that you entered when you installed the snap-in, it won't find it. So we're just going to change that now to Mexia and save that. And we would expect to have this come up in the console. Now there is no refresh, by the way, on that snap-in, so if I want to refresh it, I actually have to launch it again. And I would expect to see the application, but it's not there. Well, it turns out that string compare isn't just on the company name. It's also on the user part of the email address. It expects to see BizTalk admin. I don't know why it does this. Presumably, I suppose it's one way of preventing you from pulling down all these other applications that BizTalk creates in the background. But then again, those aren't configuration. Most of those are not configuration bags. They're actually credential stores. So again, really not sure why. As I said, this isn't the slickest tool. If we launch it again now, this time our application appears. And there's the two keys that I created. Now, I have the ability to do quite a few things here. I can delete the application, import another application that I've created with this same tool. And I can export the application. When you do that, it will ask you to provide a password for it to keep the data secure. So let's go ahead and add a new key. We'll make this TFN, something that you might want to be secure. And no, that's not my TFN, of course. Okay, so we'll create that key, and now if we launch our .NET client, we should be able to query that key. And by the way, although the application obviously name is not case sensitive, the key is. So you'll notice it doesn't retrieve it. So there you've seen some examples of how to interact with SSO in storing configuration using the command line, using the .NET interface, and also using a GUI tool like the MMC Snap-in that's freely downloadable from Microsoft. Here are some helpful resources that will guide you in learning more about Enterprise SSO and application config options in BizTalk. There's also a link to Richard Sirota's custom tool for AppConfig that is a great deal more slick than the Microsoft MMC Snap-in demoed here. Richard's blog has plenty of info and examples, so you don't need me to demonstrate it here. I hope that you found this webcast useful and informative. Please also take some time to visit our user group's web portal, where you'll find plenty of other links and resources. If you decide to join, and membership is free, you'll not only have access to more areas of the portal, including downloads of presentations and code samples and participation in the discussion thread, but you'll also receive event notifications and newsletters from BizTalk. I promise you won't be spammed, and you can always unsubscribe if you change your mind. Again, I'm Dan Toomey, and I want to thank you for listening to this webcast. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to use the YouTube comments stream for this.